Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks very much indeed for coming. I'm Alex Nichol. I'm a senior fellow here. We're talking about NATO. When NATO's leaders get together just beside the M4 motorway in Wales in September, they are certainly going to have plenty to talk about. The past few months have seen some extraordinary developments which raise new questions about the NATO alliance and about the capabilities that NATO members will need to focus upon as they pull out of Afghanistan. Naturally, we're following these events and issues closely here at the ISS, and you may have seen, for example, the extensive series of articles on Ukraine and Russia in the latest issue of our journal, Survival, as well as blog posts on our website on Ukraine, Iraq, and so on. And both before and after the NATO summit, we're holding a series of expert workshops and other events on some of the issues facing the alliance. And I'd like to thank NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, the UK Ministry of Defence, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office for supporting this programme of ISS activities. Our first expert workshop takes place here tomorrow on NATO as a maritime power, and I'm delighted to welcome those who are going to participate in that workshop. And I'm also delighted that we have Dr. Andrew Murrison here to provide a keynote address on the changing international order and NATO. Dr. Murrison's a particularly appropriate person to have here at the beginning of a maritime seminar because he himself was a medical officer in the Royal Navy for 18 years before he was elected to Parliament in 2001. And even after that, he was recalled to serve in Iraq in 2003. As a PPS in the Department of Health, he made a series of recommendations about healthcare for members of the armed forces, which are now being put into effect. And he's published a book about the military covenant. In 2012, he was appointed Minister for International Security Strategy, with many responsibilities, including, I notice, NATO transformation and reform. And he's also the Prime Minister's Special Representative for the commemoration of the centenary of the First World War. Dr. Murrison, thanks for giving this address, and the floor is yours.
Well, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here at Arundel House, the home of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. There is no better way to prepare for a NATO summit when maritime will be high on the agenda than rehearsing key arguments in this hotbed of security expertise. I trust you will forgive me for not staying for dinner, but I find myself suffering the aftershocks of norovirus, a bug typically associated with maritime incapacity, in my case, sadly, without even the consolation of a holiday on a cruise ship. I have a personal as well as a professional interest in our subject matter tonight, if Admiral Hudson will forgive me. I am one of a small group of politicians who have served with Stanislav Forlant, which I did as squadron medical officer in a Leander-class frigate in the late 1980s, part then of the 7th Frigate Squadron, and for a short period with Stana Forchan on board a Dutch minehunter, during which I developed a fondness for Indonesian curry, a close cousin of our British national dish appropriated from the Indian subcontinent. I think that's quite enough about food. And nostalgia aside, I have no desire to revisit or reinvent the fag end of the Cold War. But I put to you that we need to recapture something of the strong contingent maritime capability of the 1980s. Recent aggression reminds us that the need to secure sea lines of communication, influence events, exert leverage, and operate from the high seas without physical entanglement never actually went away. The public and political appetite to commit forces to intervention has diminished as a result of Iraq and Afghanistan, which means planning for fewer boots on the ground and an enhanced role for assets that can stand off to deliver effect. Meanwhile, Russia's outrageous action in Ukraine is resetting our assessment of NATO's future fast. The organization's response to the crisis has been considered and proportionate in my view, and the UK has been at the leading edge of assurance measures which have included an increased focus on the NATO Baltic states. 4 RAF Typhoon aircraft are currently deployed to reinforce the Polish roulement of NATO's standing peacetime Baltic air policing mission. RAF Sentry E-3D aircraft, AWACS, are contributing as part of the NATO Airborne Early Warning and Control Force to NATO operations in the airspace of our eastern allies. UK troops have engaged in exercises on Allied territory in the area, and HMS Montrose is participating in a US-run exercise in the Baltic as I speak. Ukraine has also caused us to reflect on the solemnity of Article 5, NATO's core purpose, its badge, and its burden. Be in no doubt that others will be watching to see how we respond, and we can't afford to be seen to be prevaricating or sending conflicting signals. We court war when intent is unclear and resolve uncertain, a debating point for historians in this of all years. Ambiguity is no good, so it will be vital that the NATO summit in Wales delivers reassurance in spade loads and that we leave no room for misunderstanding in the minds of those watchers. But to provide an effective contingent capability now and beyond the Wales summit, we must overcome some key challenges. The US pivot to the Asia-Pacific region, the fact that post-Afghanistan we will no longer have the crucible of collaboration that ISAF represented and which bound us together, and the continued squeeze on defence budgets. Can I put before you this evening 4 propositions? First, that we must invest properly in maritime defence. No NATO member can be a passive consumer of defence capability. I have just renewed my household insurance premium at an eye-watering cost. But to enjoy the cover, you have to pay the premium. In 2011, former US Defense Secretary Robert Gates warned the blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the US Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources to be serious and capable partners in their own defence. It's a chilling thought, but spot on. Nations must produce capability as well. Despite reports you may have seen to the contrary, I'm glad to say that the UK is one of the few NATO countries that is spending more than the target of 2% on GDP on defence. But all must put their money where their mouth is. Big countries have a responsibility to lead smaller nations to water and take the lead in encouraging all to invest seriously in maritime capability. So you will forgive me if I dwell momentarily on what the UK is doing in this space. We're channeling our energies into the high-spec capability of the Queen Elizabeth class carrier, which is to be named by Her Majesty next month at Rosyth. And we plan for this carrier to be equipped from 2020 with the F-35 Bravo aircraft. This marks the UK's return to full carrier strike and littoral manoeuvre capability, allowing operations at sea or deep inland when many may have thought our defence effort was declining. We have the Type 45 destroyer, the most advanced anti-air warfare destroyer in the world. These formidable platforms are at sea now and working alongside allies in the most challenging environments. If our US friends will forgive me, I took a fleeting moment of pleasure in observing at the 100th anniversary of the Royal Australian Navy last year that the UK had easily the most capable craft in Sydney Harbour, the Type 45 HMS Daring, operating with our allies many miles from home. We've just launched HMS Artful, the third of the 7 astute boats, the most powerful attack submarines ever operated by the Royal Navy. But investment without a clear view of strategic direction is not an investment well made. And this is my second proposition. It's good to see that NATO's Alliance Maritime Strategy, the AMS, makes clear in its very first lines the context in which we will be determining that direction. It says, the evolving international situation of the 21st century heralds new levels of interdependence between states, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations. And later, collective defense and deterrence, including nuclear deterrence, remain the essential political military cornerstone of NATO's solidarity and mutual commitment. Collective defence through the AMS is, I'm sure you'll not be surprised to hear, something that the UK government supports. The existing document provides a straightforward explanation of NATO's role in the maritime domain, as well as recognising the need for transformation, but it currently lacks detail, particularly on how the strategy should be delivered and resourced. Although that is being rectified in part through the strategic reviews of Operation Ocean Shield and Active Endeavour, there is much more to be done. The conclusions to this process will be central to the maritime deliverables at the Wales Summit, and I'll touch on one or two of those in the context of our broader objectives for the summit in my concluding remarks. But strategic direction is also about avoiding duplication. Investment in doubling up is likewise not an investment well made. So the fact that the AMS notes the need for further transformation of NATO's maritime forces organisation and capabilities is welcome. And here we're talking about making it more effective through better NATO-EU coordination, as well as cooperation with partner and non-partner nations. But what of the European Union? The European Council in December last year identified the need to develop an EU maritime strategy. It's something that the UK government supports, a strategy that looks across a much broader range of maritime security issues than would be appropriate for NATO, reflecting a comprehensive approach that fits with our vision for the European Union. But the importance of the EU maritime security strategy, avoiding duplication with the existing NATO AMS, is absolutely key and bears repeating. The EU MSS should be about maritime security and information sharing. The focus of the NATO AMS is delivering defence capability. Early drafts of the EU document contained almost no mention of NATO and none at all of the AMS. But recent drafts are more encouraging, and we hope that the UK will be able to fully support the framework document that is due to be presented to the EU Council at the end of the month. So strategy, providing the sense of direction, is important, yes, but we mustn't get hung up about creation of new structures or about new wiring diagrams or ritzy headquarters. And my third proposition brings us back again to the vital concept of contingency that I set out in the beginning. Even before Ukraine, it was evident that there was more that could be done to provide sufficient maritime forces at the right readiness and capability. The existing standing naval force is under-resourced, and two of the standing naval groups that make up the SNF have been focused on maritime security operations, such as Operations Active Endeavour and Ocean Shield. So they rarely train together or with partners. And NATO has also struggled recently to attract the level of forces needed for the standing naval groups on these operations, which means those standing naval groups are poorly placed to be brought together as part of the NATO Maritime Initial Response Force. So we strongly support ongoing work to reinvigorate the standing naval groups, changing their makeup, allowing them to conduct more regular and more advanced exercises and training, and using them to work with partners in key areas of interest to NATO, such as the Indian Ocean or Mediterranean. But we also need to look at the next level of contingency, the follow-on forces that come after the IRF when a larger NATO response is called for. The current arrangement the response force pool is made up of forces allocated to NATO with little expectation of being called up. Their preparation reflects the fact that these forces don't train together at all and are at extended readiness. Recent events have underlined that this approach needs to be reviewed. So it is our view in the UK that we need to revive the SNF so that it can act as a much more effective initial response force and create a maritime contingency force as a more coherent follow-on facility. The idea is that this MCF would not demand additional forces, which is just as well, but rather seek to make more efficient use of what we've got. And that leads me to my final point today. My fourth proposition is that we need to do more to reinvigorate and revitalize our network of alliances and groupings, the habit of working together, which I touched on at the beginning. In other words, the task groups that will contribute to the Maritime Contingency Force will need to be ready formed, integrated, and ready for deployment. By allocating forces to NATO that are already being used nationally or multilaterally, we would create a force that would be more ready when NATO needed it, better trained, and more easily integrated, while allowing allies the flexibility to use these forces until they are needed by NATO. And while, of course, the transatlantic link remains the cornerstone of our endeavours, this really is an area where European NATO needs to step up. Look at what's available now from European allies, potentially 2 small carriers, 11 large amphibious vessels, nearly 150 frigates and destroyers, 68 submarines, and the list goes on. NATO must capitalise on these assets, both for enhancing NATO's strategic capability itself, but also more directly as a means of being capable of reacting fast to contingencies. A number of examples exist already or are at a mature stage of development. Consider the framework nation concept, in which multilateral task groups are led by one of the larger partners. Consider the nascent Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, which will be UK-led, but with likely partners including Denmark, Estonia, the Netherlands, Norway, Lithuania, and Latvia. We plan to sign a letter of intent with key potential participating nations at the NATO summit in Wales in September. And the JEF will be further enhanced when UK carrier-enabled power projection becomes available. At the top end of the scale, we look forward particularly to reinvigoration of large-scale NATO training exercises, such as exercise Trident Juncture next year, the largest joint NATO exercise for more than a decade. The UK will provide the maritime component commander in this exercise in preparation for taking over as the Maritime Higher Readiness Force Commander in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached a watershed moment, pun intended, because there is now urgency in our need to thrash out maritime NATO's future role, strategy, and capability. We face threats global in scale, international piracy, blockades of vital economic choke points from the Horn of Africa to the rapidly unfreezing north, and threats on our doorstep, as the Ukraine reminds us. It would be a tall order to face any of these dangers alone, so we must be ready to act collectively. That's why the Wales NATO summit will be so important, not only as an opportunity to get our maritime story straight, but for delivering on other commitments too. Notably, on Afghanistan, where we want to see financial and practical support to the Afghan security forces after the International Security Assistance Force mission ends this year. Commitments on the prioritization of capabilities necessary to deliver NATO's strategic concept. John Donne said, No man is an island. Well, neither metaphorically are nation states. Whether you enjoy a coastline or not, maritime capability is vital. And in September, this quintessentially maritime nation will underscore the point in Wales. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister, for spelling out the issues very, very clearly, and for your four propositions, which I think really touched on some of the key issues as we come up to the summit. I'd like to open it up immediately to questions, and so, yeah.
Thank you very much. Dr. Murrison, I wonder if I could ask you a couple of quick questions.
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry, Ted C. from BASIC here in London. A couple of quick questions on the changing international order and NATO, although not necessarily in a maritime context. First off, if NATO allies were offered the opportunity to travel back in time to April 2008 to the Bucharest summit and given a chance there to rethink their promise to Georgia and Ukraine of eventual alliance membership, in your opinion, ought they to do so? Secondly, given the widespread unpopularity in all 5 host nations of U.S. theater nuclear weapons, the B-61 gravity bombs, does it seem to you that there might be some eventual threat to NATO solidarity for the alliance to continue to insist that there is real consensus on maintaining those weapons in Europe?
Thank you. It's on.
Cool. Thank you very much. I think Georgia's a good case in point. I think our commitments to it and our discussions with it have been reasonably straightforward and clear, and Georgia's expectations equally are very clear in relation to the map that it expects to see in the near future. We need to, in my opinion, make sure that we continue the dialogue with Georgia so that ultimately its aspirations are satisfied. NATO being an organisation that doesn't attract members, that's not our purpose, but is willing to have an open door policy towards them. I believe that's what we were talking about in 2008. So the central tenet that NATO is open to members remains the case today, as it did in 2008. For countries that aspire to NATO membership, we should continue to be welcoming, whilst not being in the position of trying to sell membership. I think there's a misunderstanding on this point. And one can begin to understand Russia's unease, given the misperception that we are out there recruiting members to join the organisation. That is simply not the case. But I think it would be wrong, having maintained all these years and having reiterated in 2008 that NATO has an open door policy to new members, for us now to be closing that down or in some retrospective way regretting our previous attitude, our previous position to NATO and its nature. There will be a debate on Georgia in particular and other aspirant members. I have no doubt that aspirant nations will want to press their case in the weeks and months ahead. And I hope that we will be able to forge a way to satisfy the aspirations that they have for eventual NATO membership. I think the debate is around the timing of that and the degree of readiness of those countries to accede to NATO. And on that, I'm afraid I can't give you any particular answers. On the commitment to NATO solidarity, I think I said in my remarks that my view is we need to be clear and unequivocal. And on a philosophical point, I would say that big wars start when there is a degree of uncertainty in relation to the events of 100 years ago. Historians, as I said in my remarks, will debate the point, but it is my conclusion that in the event that there is a lack of clarity, you can very often end up with an outcome that you did not originally intend. And I think the duty for the large NATO countries in particular is to make it crystal clear to a potential aggressor the likely outcome of transgression against Article 5 countries. That needs to be absolutely clear. And I see nothing in recent developments to suggest to me that there is a lack of commitment to that underpinning core element of NATO. And I suggest to you, ever so gently, that in the event that there was a question about Article 5, then the whole purpose of NATO would be undermined to the point that NATO would no longer be a credible organization, and we would probably have to think again the whole basis of its existence.
Thank you. Christian Lumiere in the third row, thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Christian Lumiere, Senior Fellow for Naval Forces here at the Institute. You mentioned the fact that standing groups are often under-resourced, and also much of NATO's readiness capability might be sucked into Ocean Shield or Active Endeavour at any one time, which obviously has very much maritime security focused rather than conventional deterrence or warfighting. And I wonder, therefore, whether you could elaborate what you consider to be NATO's primary role in the maritime domain to be. Is it a deterrent role, or is it a warfighting readiness role, or is it a maritime security role, or is actually maritime security something best left to other organisations such as the EU or nation states?
It has a role in all of those things. Ultimately, of course, it is to deter aggression against Article 5 countries, and clearly that is that underscores everything that maritime forces, as well as those in the air and on the land, are designed to achieve. In terms of the interface between the European Union and NATO, I would say that the European Union's principal focus must be at the softer end of the defence and security spectrum. That's a consistent position taken by the UK government. In terms of deterring piracy, for example, it has, I think, a very legitimate role. This is something played out in the commercial domain, and it is legitimate for the European Union and others to be involved. One could perhaps conjecture other scenarios where the European Union might have a role, such as immigration across the Mediterranean, for example. Those kinds of issues which are at the softer end of the spectrum, leaving the hard end, high-tech capability to NATO. That is a general observation. It doesn't just relate to the maritime domain, but I would say involves all elements of defence capability.
Thanks. Brigadier Ben Barry in the first row, thanks.
Thank you very much for your very clear remarks. You didn't mention France in any of them.
I suppose the answer to that is probably I didn't, and that's a severe omission. I think I probably did indirectly, did I not, in talking about multinational agglomerations, and perhaps it gives me a cue for talking about variable geometry as far as it relates to defence, which I think will exercise us greatly in Wales in September. You will know full well that we have in CGEF, rather confusingly named, because of course we might think it's a variety of Jeff, which it isn't, a new formation that has arisen since the Lancaster House treaties of 2010, and I think actually marks a step change in our relationship with our very important EU and NATO partner, France. France has to really, I think, decide where it really wants to pitch its effort. Is it truly a signed-up, committed member of NATO? And in recent years, the direction of travel has, I think, been very positive. Or does it simply wish to throw the resource it has, which is considerable, into European Union defence? And I suspect France and the UK have slightly different visions on how Europe might approach defence, and certainly some of the comments made by significant French politicians recently would suggest that it strongly suggests that it feels that defence in Europe needs to be defence under CSDP, or certainly as part of the EU defence identity. Now, at that point, we part company, and I perceive that there needs to be some debate between France and the UK on exactly where this goes, because apropos my earlier remarks, the UK's vision is the European Union having a role at the softer end of defence and security, with top-end, high-tech being the preserve of NATO. I suspect that the views of the French establishment would depart from that. But I think in the CGEF, we have an example, and a big one, of the UK's desire to engage in multiple geometry and seeking alliances and networks that I referred to that fall out with the formal EU or NATO structures. We can think of a number of examples where the UK is engaged in such a thing with other partners, and indeed in Europe of nations that are members of NATO, members of the EU, doing things together that fall completely out with those formal supranational structures. I think that's to be encouraged. At the end of the day, we do need coalitions of the willing. And one of the faults, I think, of the European Union and its defence identity has been the complete impossibility, in many cases, of getting political agreement to deploy military force. And we think particularly of the EU battle groups, which have some utility in terms of training. But in terms of deployability, I think most would accept are distinctly limited, and certainly that has been our experience. If one has coalitions of the willing, however, it's a different matter. And in the event that you had members of the EU battle group, for example, and the political will of the Commission to use them, you got a potentially potent force. Sadly, those two things are unlikely, statistically, ever to align.
Thank you. Gentleman in the second row here, thank you.
I understand that the primary goal or objective of the NATO is for defense and the security. But it seems to me that the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is the Middle East peace envoy, is carrying a brief for intervention in Iraq. Does it not contradictory to his peace envoy, as a peace envoy, and talking about the war and intervention or warfare, which will bring more disaster than the peace?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I should preface my remarks by saying that I voted against the Iraq war in 2003, but as Alex kindly pointed out, I actually served later that year in Iraq. No particular contradiction between those two positions, but I firmly maintain that the Iraq war was a mistake. And indeed, I take the view that the current position with ISIS is a result of actions taken in 2003. That seems to me to be logical, and I find it bizarre that Tony Blair should suggest otherwise. I think there's very little appetite in this country for expeditionary warfare at this juncture. As I said in my remarks, we are not looking for boots on the ground. Politicians need to listen to their publics, and the public, I think, would be horrified if its government were to repeat 2003, and I see no indication that it intends to do so. The situation in Iraq is a tragedy, and I hope that the UK will be among the leaders in trying to assist that country to a peaceful and prosperous future. I think we need to be realistic about our expectations for the immediate future, or indeed in the medium term. But I suspect the solution is going to be played out far more in the assistance and diplomatic arena rather than in the military. And I see little prospect of an intervention of the sort that I certainly opposed in 2003.
Thank you. Professor Grove, I think, in the back row.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murrison, for, I must say, one of the most intelligent speeches and presentations I've heard from a minister for a very, very long time. So thank you very much indeed. I was just thinking, actually, that what you said about the emphasis on the maritime strategy is very, very important. For several years now, I've been saying that, sadly, the SDSR put our defence posture in a totally wrong-headed direction. Large investment in the army, hiding in its Afghan blanket, that allows it to maintain 500 horses, each the cost of a lieutenant colonel. And yet we cut down our frigate and destroyer force from the 26 we actually need to 19. Happily, we are still investing in the carrier force. But surely for an island nation, as you've said yourself, we need to invest, as 1940 proved, in maritime and air forces. How easily do you think it will be to redirect our defence posture in the next SDSR into the right kind of direction, so we can cope not only with our own defence, which is as much against Russian aircraft coming over the northern part of Britain and so on, so that we can actually intervene where we need to in various parts of the world, including Europe. There was actually, if you look at the arguments for the aircraft carrier in the SDR in the late 90s, possibly even putting an aircraft carrier into the Baltic to help defend Eastern European countries against an unnamed East European nation. How far is it possible for us in the current circumstances to redirect our whole defence posture in a direction that will actually defend us and not maintain the army in the condition to which it's become accustomed?
Well, you're tempting me to be partisan, and I'm very glad my interests have already been declared. And I'm not sure that Chief of the General Staff would entirely agree with your proposition. I think it's fair to point out that we are investing 160 billion over 10 years in equipment and equipment support. Actually, that's a hell of a lot, particularly for a country that has found itself in a parlous state economically. And although recent indications are that the economy is improving, it's going to take a long time to eradicate our deficit entirely. And I'm afraid it does mean that we have to look at all spending departments, and defence is always the one that comes up in that context, to see what we can do to assist in what has been an existential threat for us, and that is the state of our economy. So I would actually say that the glass certainly is half full, not simply half empty. I'm not going to anticipate the SDSR. You'll be surprised to hear, by making any comments about where we might repivot, if that is required, our effort, our expenditure. What I would just observe, though, is this, that one hopes for a reasonable lead-in time in defence to a particular challenge emerging. Sometimes you get that lead-in, sometimes you don't. But there are things that you need to invest in now in order to address a contingency that may arise in 10 years' time. And that is the high-tech end of defence and security. And it's not just the kit, it's also the individuals, given the length of time you need to have to train highly skilled technicians and people who are able to look after the top end of equipment that you may require that many years ahead. I think it's always going to be important to have people who are potentially boots on the ground. But I think any SDSR is going to have to consider the likelihood of the UK deploying those boots on the ground against the likelihood, politically, of equipment that might be used to deliver effect from a distance. I'm thinking, for example, of Libya, where we were able to deliver effect. There was no political appetite to have boots on the ground. 100 years ago, there may very well have been, But there is no political appetite in this day and age to commit to boots on the ground if it seems likely that a substantial number of those people would be put at risk. And I think that gives added imperative to high-tech, high-end stuff, which doesn't necessarily mean maritime or air, actually, since the deployment of land forces these days may very well end up delivering high-tech, high-end stuff. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question satisfactorily, but just gives an idea perhaps of my thinking in this matter as we approach, obviously, the SDSR in 2015, without giving you too much, I hope, in the way of clues as to the likely outcome of that review.
Thank you very much. James Hackett in the front row.
Thanks, Dr. Murrison. If I can maybe probe you a little bit more on the SDSR question and also go back to the EU. I mean, what key do you think joint force capabilities and cross-governmental capacities developed over the last decade plus of enduring land operations do you think the government will look to retain in the next SDSR, and what is MOD looking to prioritise and other government departments looking to prioritise, and what might they bin out of those capabilities, thinking of language skills, cross-cultural abilities, the wider suite of capabilities. And going back onto the EU and NATO, EU-NATO duplication and lack of coordination is something you've mentioned, is something that many people have talked about in the past. So what's making possible the developments that you've mentioned with regard to the AMS? What's changed, given that there have been long-standing institutional impediments to cooperation between the two institutions that really haven't gone away? And what does that then in turn mean for the durability of the coalitions or informal arrangements that you mentioned quite positively in your answer earlier on? Thanks.
I think the first thing about cross-departmental sort of joined-up government stuff in defence and security, the first thing I would cite is the advent of the National Security Council. It really has made a difference. It may not necessarily be universally popular with Secretary of State for Defence, since, if you like, their capacity for autonomous action has been diluted somewhat since it's become cross-departmental. But in terms of government's joined-up approach to defence and security, I think it's been a shot in the arm. I would also say that in terms of upstream conflict prevention, although it is a work in progress, the structural changes to the British Army will, I am confident, prove to be game-changing. So within this, as you will know, the army will be, the elements of the army will be assigned a region. Regions, not a comprehensive coverage by any means, since that would be simply foolish, but regions which we think are particularly important to us and particularly important in terms of upstream conflict prevention. So that work is ongoing, and what it will mean is that those elements of the British Army will have an ongoing and enduring relationship with a particular part of the world. What that means in turn is that the young men and women joining those particular units will be able to have an enduring ability to have cultural awareness, I hope linguistic skills where that's appropriate, and a sort of feeling of association with the part of the world to which the unit that they are a member of is assigned. I think that's actually potentially quite powerful. What we can't do, in your point about language skills, is replicate the American Army setup and its foreign service officers. We're simply not big enough to do that. And we're also mindful of the fact that at the moment, when we give people language skills, very often it's a huge investment for very little return. If we can ensure that young people joining the armed forces can look forward to many years of using the skills which we are expensively giving them, I think we are onto a winner, both for them and for the service and ultimately for our collective security and defence. And I think that's potentially quite an exciting development in terms of the long-term role, particularly for the army. The second point I wasn't quite sure about. Could you?
Well, what's enabled the development of EU-NATO cooperation? You talked about the alliance strategy, the maritime strategy. You said they've been progress in that.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of this has to do with, at the moment, a series of bilateral and multilateral agglomerations. For example, the Northern Group, which UK is a leading member of, facilitates the close alignment not only of EU-NATO, but of countries with a capability outside either or both of those organisations. And we are seeing at the moment this multiple, this variable geometry in which some countries choose to engage, some countries choose not to, and some simply want to operate at a particular level. So we're getting away from the all or nothing standpoint of EU, NATO, and developing a far more complex, far more sophisticated scheme of networks and alliances, which I think will enable ultimately the EU and NATO to operate more closely together in the future. I have to say that we are all the time, and I think the UK is taking the lead in this, trying to get European NATO, though I do hesitate to use that term for, I think, fairly obvious reasons, to do more together. I think it's important that we encourage European NATO to operate more closely together, particularly given the repivoting of the US and the US's own expectations in terms of Europe doing more together. And I suspect we're going to be seeing more of that in the future, notwithstanding the US's stated commitment, continuing commitment to Western Europe.
Thank you. Minister, if I can just continue on that theme a little bit and talking about the costs of all this. You mentioned in your remarks that the speed with which everything's been happening in Ukraine, and you referred then also to readiness and the need to be able to deal with contingencies. If armed forces are at a heightened state of readiness, doesn't that have a cost? And therefore raises the question of how it would be raised. And also, you talked about the US pivot and the need for Europe to step up, and you listed the assets that Europe has collectively, but for them to be really a more meaningful force, some of them anyway, wouldn't that also have a cost? And so I suppose the killer question here then is, will the summit succeed, do you think, in changing the kind of trajectory of spending, or can it all just be done through better cooperation?
Yeah. Well, clearly we want to get countries to commit to more spending on kit and supporting that kit, but I think it goes beyond that. It also has to do with ensuring that they're capable of operating that kit together. If you go to Portsmouth Naval Base right now, I wouldn't be at all surprised if you hardly see any warships there at all. If you were to go to the principal naval bases of some of our allies, I bet you'd see lots of them. And the difference is our platforms are all out doing stuff. So we're already doing operational things. And I think aligned to that, we need to talk very closely to those partners who are not spending anywhere close to 2% to encourage them to do so. And part of that 2% needs to be spent on operating the platforms that they have. So I would say you're right, you are quite right in asserting that operations mean cost. But having kit that doesn't operate, frankly, you wonder what the point of it all is. And I think there are lessons to be learned by some of our allies about sweating assets. And the British tax-paying public can be absolutely certain that we are sweating our assets. There's no doubt about that. The same cannot be said of some of our partners, I'm afraid. And I think one of the challenges in Wales will be, A, to get more of these countries to spend close to the 2%, and B, to encourage them to spend that money wisely. And part of that is operating the stuff that they do have in collaboration with other partner nations. So I accept your point about cost, and I think it's wrapped up with a 2% target and the need to operate more closely together.
Great, thank you very much. Who else would like to raise a point? Yes, in the back row there, thank you.
Good evening, Minister. I'm a Royal Naval officer. I come from a boots-on-the-ground side of the House. On the basis that you don't need a Ferrari to go to the supermarket and do the weekly shop, is there not a danger that in stretching the budget so far to get what you've described as the high-end capability and such a small number of assets, that what you end up with is a slightly unbalanced force? Because I mean, some of the threats that you alluded to in terms of piracy, terrorism is obviously a big issue for the National Security Council. You simply don't need the high-end, extremely expensive assets to take on. I'm certainly not advocating that you don't need them at all, but is there not a danger that we end up with a fleet that's very, very small, extremely capable, but we don't have appropriate assets to deal with probably the more day-to-day risks that our country faces?
Yeah. Often get this from naval officers, particularly naval officers who want to command warships, since the provision of a range of Gucci corvettes, for example, would be right up their street. And I do fully accept that, I understand that. And indeed, there's a good argument for having a relatively low-tech fleet. And there are risks with having all your assets tied up in, for example, Type 45s. We are actually investing in OPVs. We're doing that right now, and they're very nice, and I'm sure will be a useful addition to our overall bearing. But at the end of the day, a judgment has to be taken about what Britain is about as a maritime nation. Now, I think, apropos my remarks about sweating assets, we have decided that our limited resources need to be focused on making sure that we are just about still a globally deployable force. We always say that. Sometimes, of course, it's stretched. But I think if we were to start putting a significant chunk of that into a coastal force or into relatively minor war ships, we would no longer be able to easily sustain the assertion that we are globally deployable. However, your remarks have been noted, and no doubt similar remarks will be part of the SDSR in 2015. And I would say to you that there is a perfectly respectable argument for the UK looking more closely at the lower tech end of the maritime spectrum, but that would come, I think, with a very significant costs in respect of our pretensions to being the leading European maritime force.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the third row, thank you. If you just wait for the mic, thanks.
Robert Lanyon from ExxonMobil. Slightly tangential, but on the subject of energy trade and supply. Over the next couple of decades, there's going to be huge demand, growth in demand in energy demand around the world. Obviously, a lot more growth in trade from, say, the Middle East out to Asia Pacific of oil, potentially from the Arctic as well. You're going to see great growth in liquefied natural gas, supplies moving around the world. And question really is, do you see that as having challenges or implications for international security generally? And if you have any comments on that.
Absolutely. It is really very worrying. I think some of us perhaps lost sight of that before Ukraine. And although we're not dependent upon Russian fossil fuels to any great extent, our neighbours are. And if I can re-quote John Donne, we can't simply ignore that our neighbours are heavily reliant upon this extremely difficult nation, which under its current leadership could quite easily decide that it wanted to turn off the tap. What Ukraine has done, I think, is to accelerate our consideration of how to reduce our reliance on other countries, particularly those that are unstable or are challenging, as Mr. Putin's Russia has proved to be, to our very great distress. As a constituency MP, for example, I'm faced at the moment with a lot of angry constituents who are worried about fracking, about which there is a great deal of misunderstanding. One of my counter-arguments is that fracking offers only part, of a remedy to energy security threats that we face. So whilst I'm sure that the SDSR next year will focus quite heavily on threats like energy security, I think the remedy is very largely in making sure that we reduce our reliance and encourage a reduction in the alliance and our partner states on energy from countries which are simply unreliable as a producer and exporter of vital commodities.
Thank you very much. Well, Minister, I think this has been a true keynote event, and that you've set out some very clear propositions. You've given us a great deal to think about, and also you've answered all the questions that have been put to you in such a clear and sensible and straightforward way. So I think we're very deeply grateful for you for doing this, and thanks very much indeed.
My pleasure.